Policy in the 1990s, the setting and strategic choices. A wonderful topic. Many believe that Americans are confused by the end of what we roughly call the Cold War, that American intellectuals have failed to connect American purpose with international realities, and that the required debate about America's role in policy has never gotten off the ground in this new era. And we're proceeding with a practice of policies which sometimes are not consistent or coherent. And to the extent to which all of that is true, it's important that we look at the big picture and analyze it. And the topic for tonight, American foreign policy in the 90s, setting and strategic choices, is absolutely appropriate, I think, for our era, and we're delighted that Reverend Dr. Hehir has agreed to address it for us. Now, if you gave me until the end of the session, 7:10 this evening, I might begin to do justice to his resume. 14 pages of publications, honorary degrees from 25 colleges, significant awards such as for 5 years a Fellow of the MacArthur Foundation, numerous lectureships, delegations, advisorships, trusteeships, member of distinguished centers and councils. He's been on delegations to the United Nations, to major activities within the Catholic Church, of course. The trusteeships have included the Arms Control Association, the Overseas Development Council. But a couple of suggestions. His Bachelor of Arts degree is in philosophy from the St. John's Seminary, from which he also received his Master of Divinity degree. His Doctor of Theology degree is from the Harvard Divinity School. His field of study there was ethics and international politics, which gives shape and definition to his writings, his career, and his interests, which I have not been able to adequately touch. Let me give the brief summary of his career. From 1973 to 1992, Father Hehir served in Washington at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops and at Georgetown University. At the Bishops' Conference, he was director of the Office of International Affairs for over a decade, secretary of the Department of Social Development and World Peace for another 4 or 5 years, and counselor for social policy for 4 years. At Georgetown, he served as the Joseph P. Kennedy Professor of Christian Ethics in the School of Foreign Service and at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. In 1991 to 1992, he served as Associate Vice President for Church and University Issues at Georgetown. At present, he is, among other things, counselor to the Catholic Relief Services here. And of course, the Catholic Relief Services is a wonderful part of, obviously, the world community, but also a very nice part of our local community. And we appreciate, for example, the service of Ken Hackett, the director of the service, on our Board of Trustees, and appreciate his warm recommendation of Reverend Hehir. He also is, at present, professor of the Practice in Religion and Society, Harvard Divinity School. And he's also a member of the executive committee of the Harvard Center for International Affairs. His background is truly distinguished, his intellectual efforts most impressive, and I think the topic for tonight is not only important, but of great interest. It's my pleasure and honor to present to you Reverend J. Bryan Hehir.
Thank you very much. I really do want you to let me know if you can't hear. You interrupt no matter what critical point of the world I'm trying to explain. Just let me know if my voice goes down a notch and you can't hear me. Can everyone hear me now? Okay, all right. I first want to express my appreciation to the Council on Foreign Affairs for this invitation to speak. I am in a situation where I spend half of the week teaching at Harvard, and since July of this year, half of the week here at Catholic Relief Services. So I learned Baltimore only slowly and incrementally, and this for me is a wonderful opportunity to encounter the city precisely around the kinds of issues that bring me to Baltimore to work. So let me express my appreciation for the invitation to give this address. I tried to draw the topic broadly. That is risky. I may give you a narrow address on a broad topic, and that would be unfortunate, but I hope I won't do that. But when I was asked to speak about an issue on foreign policy, it seemed to me that speaking in January of 1997, it would be good to step back and try and take a look at the whole rather than to concentrate on one or other specific aspect of foreign policy. So what I will try and do tonight, and leave plenty of time for question and commentary, what I propose to do is to describe U.S. foreign policy choices, at least some of them, as I see them in the 1990s. I will specifically try to do that from both an empirical and ethical point of view. That is to say, to look at the complexity of the issues themselves, but running through the talk will be an attempt to assess U.S. policy choices from a moral argument. My way of trying to do this will be to proceed in 3 steps. I want to talk first about the setting for U.S. foreign policy, or what one might call the shape of the post-Cold War world. So at the outset, I want to describe some interpretations of the kind of world we face. Secondly, I'd then like to propose my own interpretation of that world and how I see the setting for U.S. foreign policy. And then thirdly, to come to what I'll call choices and cases for American foreign policy. So let me begin with a quick sketch of the shape of the post-Cold War world as it is seen by at least selected authors and analysts of U.S. foreign policy. Everyone agrees that to live in the 1990s is to live in a period of deep, powerful, and substantial transition in world politics. We are all agreed that, to use Toynbee's distinction, this is a time not of organic choices, normal choices, but critical choices. And almost all analysts agree on what has passed away and creates the time of transition. What has passed away is a world that we were very familiar with. For 50 years, the character of the world that faced American foreign policy was dominated by 2 clear facts. The world was a bipolar world divided between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And secondly, that bipolar world had at the heart of the bipolar competition the enormous fact of nuclear weapons. Interestingly enough, we watched that world literally collapse before us. We saw it happen on television as the wall came down. We saw the Soviet Union literally collapse over a weekend, an empire dismantled before us. And so on the other side of this enormous shift from a bipolar world filled with nuclear weapons, we now stand at a point of trying to assess where we are. Perhaps the best historian of the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis, now of Yale University, put it this way after the Soviet Union had collapsed. Gaddis said, I paraphrase him, "We now stand at one of those rare moments in history when the normal constraints which bind us fall away." And his point was we had a chance to shape the world in a way that few generations ever get. Now, while there's consensus of what has passed away, there is not consensus among the analysts or the actors in world politics about what has taken its place. There has been no single vision that has captured a consensual view of the world we face, nor has there been any single policy proposal that has captured the themes of American foreign policy the way George Kennan did at the outset of the Cold War. There is no Kennan on the horizon, at least at the present time. However, there are views that seek to interpret the world and to interpret what U.S. policy ought to be. Let me offer you 3 of them. An early interpretive argument coming right after the collapse of the Cold War was that of Charles Krauthammer, the nationally syndicated columnist for the Washington Post. Krauthammer, early on, at the outset of the post-Cold War period, argued that we had moved from a bipolar world to a unipolar world, that there was now only one real superpower. And interestingly enough, while Krauthammer was vigorous in asserting that the U.S. was the sole superpower, he did not prescribe what I would call an imperial policy for the one power to do what it would. Krauthammer rather argued that since we were the one superpower, we had to conserve our energies, and so he argued for a policy of selective engagement. That is to say, in a sense, the luxury of being the one superpower meant that you could choose what you would do and what you wouldn't do. A very different vision was proposed by Henry Kissinger in his book Diplomacy, which is, in a sense, a kind of masterwork for Kissinger at the end of his academic career, an enormous tome about the history and analysis of diplomacy and the world. Kissinger argued very differently than Krauthammer that what would take the place of the bipolar world was, in fact, a world that at least would resemble the end of the 19th century. That is to say, a world of 5 or 6 powers: the United States, Russia, China, Europe, Japan, perhaps India, and that, in fact, the implications of this were that we would, by definition, have to return to a world of balance of power, where we would no longer be either in a bipolar world superior, and clearly not unipolar superiority. We would be one among many, and that the many would all employ some version of balance of power. Now, both Krauthammer and Kissinger came under critique early on. People said the difficulty with both views, while they were different views, the difficulty with both views was that they had a univocal view of power, that is to say, a single-minded conception of power. And so for both Krauthammer and Kissinger, the argument was they were thinking of power as military power, which could be translated into political influence. Now, this, of course, is the classical way of thinking about foreign policy. This is the way Thucydides teaches us to think about it. This is the way the great realist thinkers thought about world politics. Military power translatable into political influence. But the critics of Krauthammer and Kissinger said, but the world today is not like that. In fact, power is multidimensional today. If you ask who are the great powers in the world, you have to ask what kind of power you mean. For if you talk about military power, of course, the Soviet Union still ranks high, but one would not rank them high if one were thinking about economic power. The Japanese, just the opposite. If one were thinking about military power, they don't appear on the screen. If one is thinking about economic power, they appear with some fulsomeness. So the argument was that Kissinger and Krauthammer, while different in their conclusions, in a sense, both were attached to a conception of power that was real in the world, but not adequate. A third interpretation of what takes the place of the Cold War, a much more controversial interpretation because it seems so unusual, is that of my colleague Sam Huntington at Harvard. Many of you will know that in 2 articles now in Foreign Affairs, Huntington has proposed a much more drastic shift as occurring in the post-Cold War world. The way he argues the case is that for centuries, world politics has been about states, but the future of world politics, Huntington argues, will now be not about states, but civilizations. Then he makes a case of a series of great civilizations in the world, and that the fault lines will run between the civilizations, and that the conflicts of world politics, while states don't disappear, will be much more conflicts between these civilizations. Interestingly enough, for Huntington, at the center of a civilization is religion. So there's an interesting argument that it's a combination of religion and culture that will in fact be the source of conflicts in the future. Huntington's argument has moved through 2 stages. In addition to the 2 articles, he also has a book. I have not read the book, but I've read the article, so I'm not quite clear I'm giving you the whole picture. In the first article, there was an edge to his position that said, precisely because there's going to be a conflict of civilizations, the West, as he defined the West, and that itself was debated, what he meant by the West has to think about itself over against the rest, because others don't share Western values. And it was a rather conflicted conception of what the world would be, a cultural conflict. The more recent article lays less stress on conflict and more, as he puts it, on the notion that Western values are not universal values. They are unique, but not universal. So his argument, again, is to some degree that the things that the West is held together by, its conception of religion, its conception of church and state, its conception of individual rights, is not shared broadly, but there's less of a conflictual content to this second article. Now, he may resolve all of this in the book, but I'm not sure. I'm struck by the fact that there is a certain strain of the Huntington piece that's not unlike a piece of George Kennan. Kennan, as you may know, has always been skeptical about the ability to share democratic governance and institutions across the world. He has always thought it folly to do exactly what the Clinton administration said it is doing, and that is to say, to try and expand democracy throughout the world. Kennan is of the view that it's very unlikely that large parts of the world will want or will pursue democratic governance. So it's a bit like the Huntington article. Well, those are three different views of what takes the place of the Cold War. A unipolar world, a multipolar world, a clash of civilizations. I would like at this point to move to, from describing other people's position to an attempt to describe my own. Although what I'm going to call it is adopting and adapting a view of the world, because I will draw on other people here and try and combine it with my own. My own view is that the challenge of foreign policy in the 1990s is that the world in which we live, the international system as it's called, is undergoing a double transformation. And it is the double transformation that makes the world so complicated. That is to say, I think what happens in the 1990s is the two very broad streams of change come together and intersect. On the one hand, there is a change in the structure of power of world politics. On the other hand, there is a change in the principles of order of world politics. And it is the intersection of these two things that creates the context for American foreign policy to think about the world in which it exists. Now, before I describe them in any detail, let me make the case that by any standard of evaluation of world affairs, either one of these changes would pose a major policy problem. That is to say, if you lived at a time where the structure of power was changing, that's a big problem. If you live at a time where what I will call the principles of order are changing, that's a second problem. What makes the 1990s complicated is the intersection of these two trends. Let me describe them. The structure of power I really already have described. That is to say, if the bipolar world of the Cold War no longer exists, what will take its place? Now, we've gone through unipolar, multipolar, and clash of civilization. For myself, I'm more impressed by another view of the world that really comes again from two colleagues at Harvard. There's nothing original in my thought about this, Stanley Hoffman and Joe Nye. And together, they have argued that the best way to think about this emerging world is think about the world as a three-layer cake. You see, it is more complicated than either the unipolar or the multipolar. At one level of the world is about the competition for political and military influence. That's the classical view, the view that Krauthammer and Kissinger use. Hoffman and Nye argue that the world is still about political military competition. It is still there. You see it in big power relations like U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China. You see it in key areas of the world like Central Europe or the Middle East. And so the old model still exists. Their point, however, is the old model no longer consumes the world of foreign policy. So the second layer of the cake is really not about politics and military power. The second layer of the cake is about politics and wealth, or political economic relations. And what happens here is not simply that the kind of power you're talking about changes. You go from armies to dollars to capacity to function as an economic power. What happens at this second level is your picture of the world changes. In the classical view, the world is a world of states that compete with each other for influence and power across boundaries, etc. In the world of political economy, the world is a single integrated market where national boundaries mean much less than it did in the classical view of the world. In the world of political economy, states must share the stage with transnational actors. That is to say, organizations with precisely a unique ability to operate in the context of a global market, to operate in spite of national boundaries, not by observing national boundaries. And in the world of political economy, you not only have different players, not just states, but other actors. You have a different competition about wealth rather than military power. You also have a different logic that works. In the classical world of political military affairs, the logic is what an economist would call a zero-sum game. If you win, I lose. In the political economy of the world, it is possible for both to win, or all to lose. It is a mixed interest game. It has a different logic. Now you see, the point is, if you only can think one-dimensionally, your policy is in trouble. In other words, if you think well about territory and army and boundaries, that's one thing. But if you can't think well about an integrated global market, you're in trouble. If you can think well about an integrated global market but don't understand the logic of the classical model, you also can be in trouble. So there's a level that's about political military influence, there's a level about political economic influence, and then there's a third level of the world that is not about either of the above. There's a third level of the world that operates at a transnational level where there are a multiplicity of different actors, all of whom have the capacity to be rooted in one place and very often influential in many places. Now, I've already said that in the political economy there are multiplicity of transnational actors. Notice, though, that transnational actors involve many people. Transnational actors have the following characteristics. They are based in one place, present in several places, have a trained corps of personnel, a single guiding philosophy, and a sophisticated communication system.
What is the philosophy, please?
Single guiding philosophy.
Is what?
It can be anything. That's the point. That's the point. That's the point. That is to say, those characteristics fit Gulf Oil, Phillips Petroleum, IBM, and the Jesuits. They're all transnational actors. They all can do that. They all can function across borders. They can move ideas. They can move personnel. They can think about the world as an integrated global setting. The point is, the world is therefore, in this design, in the structure of power, a much more complex place. It is still a world about armies and states. It is now preeminently a world about money and power. And it is finally a world in which religious ideas, non-governmental actors involved in humanitarian service, like CR, Catholic Relief Services, and others like it, human rights organizations, operate apart from both the economy and the military and political arena. So, in trying to grasp this one change, a change in the structure of power, it is necessary to be able to grasp all three levels of the world as it exists. Grasping that in itself would be a major problem. There is a second change, however, that's going on. It is a change in the principles of order of world politics. This change has been going on longer than the collapse of the Cold War. To grasp this change, you have to go back not to the Cold War, but to what is sometimes called the Legacy of Westphalia. Westphalia, you will remember from high school civics, was the treaty that ended the religious wars in Europe in 1648. Westphalia, however, did more than end the religious wars in Europe. Westphalia gave us three things, three principles by which we think about international politics, or at least have thought about them up till the present. The product of the Westphalian legacy from the 17th century to the 20th has given us the sovereign state, the principle of non-intervention, and thirdly, the separation of religion and politics. In other words, coming out of the 17th century, there was an attempt to shape world politics along these three lines. The world is a world of sovereign states. Sovereign states should pledge themselves to non-intervention, and you should separate radically the world of religion from the world of politics. You will remember that they used this treaty to bring to a close the religious wars in Europe, so one can understand why they would do this. The point to understand about the 1990s, however, is that all three component elements of the Westphalian order, all three elements, are today in a process of erosion. So the very conceptual tools by which we think about world politics today are eroding. They are not disappearing, but they're eroding. And this process is longer than the collapse of the Cold War. The sovereign state. The sovereign state has faced a series of erosive forces for the last 50 years. The first erosive force was of the moral order, and that is the establishment of the human rights agenda of the United Nations. The establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the human rights covenants that flow from it were a major challenge to the sovereign state. Prior to the founding of the United Nations, human rights violations within states were regarded as issues of domestic jurisdiction. They belonged to the business of the state itself, and no one else legally had a right or a responsibility to do anything about human rights violations. Beginning with the founding of the UN and the UN documents on human rights, you cracked the shell of sovereignty. You cracked the shell of sovereignty by laying a challenge against the sovereign state that what happened within its territory was now to be considered the business of the world. Secondly, there was a strategic or military challenge to sovereignty, and that was the nuclear age. To be a sovereign state always meant that you could protect your citizens from attack. In the nuclear age, the two most powerful nuclear states in the world could not protect their citizens from attack. They were sovereign states, but they couldn't act like sovereign states in the face of nuclear weapons. Thirdly, the growing political economy of a single global market means an increasing interdependence whereby states, in order to be part of the economy, must sacrifice some of their sovereign control. So this is, for example, the fundamental dilemma of China. China wants to be part of the global economy. China does not believe in the post-Westphalian view of human rights, and therefore they want no critique of human rights, but they want to be part of the global economy. It is almost impossible to do both, and that's the tension of their position. And finally, there is the political challenge to sovereignty, which has occurred in the 1990s, where we see in the home of sovereignty in Europe, where states willingly cede sovereignty in the European Union in order to collaborate better. Now, all four of those forces have eroded sovereignty. None of them eliminate the sovereign state. And so you end up with a situation in the 90s where sovereignty is still greatly valued. It's what gives you identity in the world. But to be a sovereign state today is not to be a sovereign state in the classical sense of the term. Your life is eroded. Your sovereignty is more fragile. Your connections are more complicated. What's interesting is that while all this process of the erosion of sovereignty has been going on, the second component of Westphalia, namely the principle of non-intervention, on the whole remained untouched. Now, there have been interventions aplenty in world politics, and lots of interventions during the Cold War. But the notion was intervention, at least in principle, was regarded as wrong. What has happened in the 1990s is that the challenge that has gone on to the sovereign state for 50 years has now fulsomely been laid at the door of the non-intervention principle. Up through the Cold War, the premise was that in a world of sovereign states, everyone should be pledged to non-intervention. The duty of all states was to pledge not to intervene in other states' business. But I ask you to think about the foreign policy debates of the 1990s. They are about Haiti, Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda. The point is, the debate of the 90s has been, is there a duty to intervene? Now notice what you do. You take a principle that's been in possession for 400 years and you turn it upside down in the space of 4 years. That is at least complicated, if not confusing. So sovereignty, like non-intervention, both of them face erosion today. Finally, religion and politics. The purpose of Westphalia was to separate them radically. And indeed, that separation has been regarded as a kind of principle of international politics. The point today to ask is whether that separation of religion and politics as a way of thinking about world politics helps you to think about the world. That is to say, if you think that religion is a purely private issue that does not have public consequences for world politics, if you think that, and if you brief your boss on that principle, what do you do with Latin America and the Catholic Church over the last 30 years? What do you do with Hebron and the conflict that is at the heart of the Middle East? What do you do with the Bishop Tutu in South Africa? What do you do with Solidarity and the Pope in Poland? So whether you look around the world from north to south, the notion that religion is absolutely separated from politics, or that religion is not a public force, simply gives you a bad interpretation of what's happening in the world. The question of how religion and politics ought to be related is a whole other story. That's a lecture in itself. My point is that, like the sovereign state and like the principle of non-intervention, the notion that religion and politics are separate is a proposition, I think, that today is in the process of being eroded. Well, in summary, I offer you then a setting for United States foreign policy in which you end up with a three-dimensional world that cuts across politics, military power, economics, and religious and non-governmental agencies acting across the world. And in that context, even the very ideas of sovereignty and non-intervention have to be handled as if you would handle quicksand going through your hand. Even as you deal with it, you have to redefine it. How does this affect U.S. foreign policy? Let me come then to a concluding section of the talk, because I want to be sure and leave you plenty of time for questions. How do we think then about concrete choices of American foreign policy, choices and cases? First, some general comments on the policy process. Generally, I think most people would say we have moved in the Cold War to the post-Cold War. We have moved in a world that was marked by a kind of vivid clarity during the Cold War to a world that is much more dominantly marked by complexity. Larry Eagleburger, Secretary of State in the Bush administration, was quoted as saying at Georgetown University, in a talk at Georgetown just before he left office, he said, "We may get to the point where we'll have great nostalgia for the Cold War." Now, I think that's a misguided idea myself. But the point is, what he was talking about was you always knew where the threat was. You always knew where the threat was, so you did your planning in light of the threat. The notion was that there was a certain kind of clarity because the issues were regarded as a kind of radically simple conflict. Bipolarity and nuclear weapons did yield a certain kind of clarity. You remember Dr. Johnson's dictum that hanging in the morning concentrates the mind. Well, nuclear weapons and a bipolar world concentrated the policy process around a single conception. The world was frankly never as clear as we might have thought it was, and that's why we often got involved in situations where we thought they were the consequences of the Cold War, and they often didn't have much to do with the Cold War. The world might not have been as simple as it appeared, but there was a certain starkness about the Cold War. Today, the starkness is gone, and the relative clarity is gone. Complexity takes the place of clarity. The Cold War, the great fear was that a mistake would lead to a massive human catastrophe, understood as nuclear war. The threat today is no single catastrophe. The threat today may better be described as a kind of creeping chaos, the kind of thing we have just experienced in Central Africa, where there's not one great threat. There's not one cosmic fear. There is instead enormous human suffering in a situation that is very, very difficult to unravel and make sense out of. So the move from clarity to complexity, the move from catastrophic danger to kind of creeping chaos, is a kind of background for thinking about foreign policy today. If I'm right, it arises in part out of the changes I have already tried to describe. Now, this notion that clarity yields to complexity is a fairly common notion in the description of foreign policy today. There's nothing original about that. I would like to highlight another dimension, I think, that touches on foreign policy, though, that is a little different. I'd want to make the argument that one of the changes that has occurred from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period is that for American foreign policy, we have passed from a period in which I would talk about a policy of coercion to a policy of choice. Now, I need to explain my point here. What I mean by a policy of coercion is that if you put yourself in the Cold War framework, there was a sense that there was a single universal competition going on all over the world. That tended to bestow a certain strategic value on almost every geographical inch of territory in the world. And so there was a certain coercion about policy in the sense of people saying, if you don't do X, you'll pay for it in terms of Y. So the notion was that whether it was Southeast Asia or the Horn of Africa or Central America, somehow you had to do X, oppose the communists, make sure that there was no loss of territory, a loss of ideology. That caused an enormous havoc in the world. It caused some havoc for us, too, as a country. But the fact of the matter is that that kind of logic of coercion, that you had to value every place in the world, that you had to be willing to be universal in your conception of foreign policy, I submit that's one of the things that's now gone. And we've moved to what I would call a policy of choice. That is to say, there are large parts of the world today who will not and cannot possibly, in standard foreign policy terms, threaten the United States. Nor can they command the attention of the United States. There are large parts of the world today where we will be involved only if we choose to be involved. The argument that you must be involved or else you will pay a price is precisely, I think, what is not true. In a sense, Africa may be, as a continent, and certainly large parts of it in terms of countries, the illustrative choice here. In other words, when, I will come to intervention in a minute, but when we debated intervention in Rwanda or in Somalia, it had a whole different context about it than debates about intervention during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the argument was you must intervene or else there will be disastrous consequences. There is no rational way in which you can say, in empirical terms, that what happens in Rwanda or Somalia could, in any conceivable sense, pose a threat to the United States. So the question about if you will do anything is much more a question of choice than coercion. It is a choice that is a combination, I submit, of both empirical and moral factors. but it is precisely a different setting for policy than the Cold War produced. This policy of choice rather than coercion means that things that used to be assured in the American foreign policy process are no longer assured. The foreign aid budget in some form or other was always an assured piece of the budget because the notion was you had to use the money. Whether you were using it for the benefit of other people or not is another question. But the notion was you had to have a foreign aid budget. There is no guarantee today that there will be a foreign aid budget. No guarantee at all. It is clearly regarded as something that you balance against, balancing the budget in the United States, healthcare costs in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. It's a question of choice rather than coercion, and the field of choice is much freer. If that is true, I think it is fair to say that one of the things that happens in American foreign policy is the non-empirical factors, if I can put them in that term, the non-empirical factors. That is to say, our sense of obligation, responsibility, our sense of whether we think we stand in a single community of human beings, whether there are states that separate us or not, that becomes a much more strategically placed part of the foreign policy equation. If you eliminate all of that from your thinking, you will define the policy one way. If you don't eliminate that from your thinking, you will at least grapple with questions that will never come on the table if those non-empirical factors are not part of the policy process. Now let me try and illustrate in my closing remarks what I mean by kinds of choices. I would submit that to illustrate this notion of a policy of choice, I would submit that there are going to be three broad areas in which foreign policy will be made today. The first set of areas are what I would call the great power questions. Now, this is going to be the U.S. and Russia, NATO expansion, the question about what happens in Europe. It secondly is going to be the U.S. and China, and by derivation, the role of the U.S. in Asia, relationships between Japan and China and the U.S. It's going to be questions like the future of the Middle East. Those things will clearly be on the foreign policy agenda. They get close to policy of coercion. You've got to deal with those questions. Second thing that's going to be on the foreign policy agenda is political economy. To some degree, the leading edge of the Clinton policy has been a policy of economic policy. And there'll be no question that foreign policy as economic policy will continue as a major question. What is interesting, I think, is after you've done the great power questions and the political economy questions, and let's face it, the political economy questions involve the G7 countries and then a selected range of other countries in the world. But after you've done those two, then I think you're left with what I would call the rest, if I can put it in those terms. And that is to say, a multiplicity of countries and situations where precisely they cannot either threaten us, coerce us, command attention, or force us to pay attention. It is here where I think the notion of policy of choice comes into play. And it is here that, in a sense, the question of how we resolve that will have a good deal to do with what the shape of foreign policy will be in the 1990s. The first two are givens. We will have a foreign policy about great power politics and political economy. The third is an open question. Let me try and illustrate both the coercion and choice with a couple of cases. First, the question of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. If you try and choose an illustrative case to distinguish between the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, proliferation is interesting because, of course, there is the continuity of the nuclear factor. There was a nuclear question in the Cold War, and now a nuclear question remains in the post-Cold War period. But the old and new nuclear questions are quite different. The old nuclear question was precisely struggling with the danger of catastrophic cosmic damage if you made a mistake. Fascinatingly, almost without anybody predicting it, the chances that that kind of nuclear exchange that worried us for 50 years, chances of that happening, I would say, has been reduced by 70%, at least 70%. That's a remarkable fact. It might have just been luck, maybe it was skill and luck, maybe it was a mix of both, but That's been the area that I spent most time on. I tell you, in the middle of the 1980s, almost no one would predict that you would stand here in the middle of the 90s and say that the danger that old nuclear question posed is reduced by 70%. Nobody was saying it was going to happen, but it has. The proliferation issue has to deal with the question of chaos. That is to say, not massive cosmic nuclear exchange, but just the slow spread of nuclear weapons around the globe. Not lots of them, not lots of them. Countries only afford one or two. But if they spread and become, in a sense, normal weapons, then what I mean by chaos takes shape. And so you're involved in a very different situation about how you try and contain proliferation than the situation of how you deter the Soviet Union. Very different kind of situation. And as we try to do it, we've got a compromised moral baseline, because what the situation is on proliferation is that the nuclear powers try to convince non-nuclear powers not to become nuclear powers. But we say very little about what the nuclear powers are going to do about becoming non-nuclear powers. Now, some sign of the degree of change is this proposal made in the so-called Canberra report of the list of generals, that the idea that you have 100 generals or so sign up and say we ought to go to no nuclear weapons is a sign of a very changed international order. That's a lecture in itself, too. But I simply want to contrast catastrophe and chaos. Secondly, there is the question of military intervention. I said that the non-intervention principle has changed. I think we will move to a situation where there will be no longer an absolute non-intervention principle, but now what I'll call a relative non-intervention principle. In other words, rather than an absolute rule that there never should be intervention in another state, you will have a presumption against intervention and a broader series of causes that can override that presumption than used to exist. There used to be only one example of something that should override non-intervention, and that was genocide. But the fact of the matter is, of course, that in a generation, and most of us were in that generation, in a generation that grew up on the slogan, "Never again," we now have had one documented genocide, maybe two, in the 1990s. And so the non-intervention principle is on fragile grounds, fragile grounds. So once again, it is a question of not so much the kind of major big power question. That's what we're not talking about intervention in those terms. But it will be a question of sort of spreading chaos, and whether in some instances you have to override this principle that has been almost sacrosanct for 4 centuries. I think there's good reason to incrementally lessen the force of the non-intervention principle, but one must be careful about it. And finally, there is the question that I might call a combination of human rights, international engagement, and the policy of choice. This is where one talks about what I have called the rest, not the great powers, not the political economy arena, but the rest. How we think about the rest of the world in terms of the question of not only protecting human rights, but enhancing them, but also in terms of questions like foreign assistance, development assistance, the engagement of non-governmental actors and states in dealing with really the enormous bulk of the world's population who are not part of the great powers, who are outside the circle of political economy as it is traditionally defined, and yet who stand there as the major part of the world that we know, not in terms of their power, but in terms of their presence. Now, it is precisely this case that raises what I have called before a policy of choice rather than coercion. There is no guarantee of how creative, how wise, how morally informed a policy will be toward that part of the world, because there's no coercion that determines that we must act. But I submit the cost of not having a policy that is both wise empirically, morally broadly defined in terms of responsibility, in terms of the rest, is a price that we would not want to pay, I think, and look back on a world that we had ignored it. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much. Our normal routine is that I have to repeat questions for the benefit of the camera.
your
If you
hands.
don't, if that doesn't interfere with your style too much, then I hesitate to do this. The floor is now open for questions. Yes, ma'am. The question was, given your framework, do you see contradictions in the different ways that the United States deals with Cuba on one hand and China on the other?
Contradiction may be a little strong, but there's enormous differences. And I think that Madeleine Albright said she deals with them differently because China's a great power and Cuba is not. I don't think that's adequate for the basis of policy. I think there's no question, because the difference comes on human rights grounds, I think in the first instance. At least that's the test case, and we're dealing with it differently. Now, the first thing one needs to notice that I couldn't even touch tonight, because you would have been here all night, are the domestic roots of foreign policy. And obviously the domestic roots work differently, frankly. They did not always work differently on China. We had a China lobby at one time that was enormously powerful in determining what U.S. policy would be. But the China lobby today are mainly transnational corporations that want to function in China. And they really want to separate, for the most part, the human rights question from most favored nation status, et cetera, et cetera. The Cuban question is driven strongly by Florida. I mean, there's 25 electoral votes there, and you don't want to cross the state of Florida on the Cuban question. I think it is time to cut loose from that model, in all honesty. I think I think there's a good chance that it will happen by the end of this century. But I think the difference is their size and the domestic roots of the policy.
Would you comment on the ways in which communication and information may erode power or the established structure?
Well, when I talked about the forces that erode sovereignty, I laid primary stress on the interdependence argument on economic forces. But in fact, interdependence, kind of growing web of relationships that cut across national boundaries, interdependence is greatly fostered by the kind and quality of communication that we have in the world today, whether it be visual communication or whether it be the ability to move ideas across boundaries. There is no question that what is called the CNN factor is a factor in world politics. That is to say, by any account, the severity of the conflict, the number of deaths involved, et cetera, in the Sudan at least rivals Somalia and Rwanda. And we've had hardly any attention to the Sudan. That's partly because you haven't any television cameras in there. So, I mean, there's no question that the visual impact, that's not necessarily a great thing, because you can have a foreign policy that doesn't have any center when it is driven only by images. On the other hand, it's a good thing to call the world's attention to things. So that's one thing. Secondly, the ability to move ideas. I mean, email is a subversive force, if there ever was one, in world politics. I mean, because people can just move ideas across borders. I mean, the Chinese have to know they're on the wrong end of that battle. I mean, the Tiananmen Square battle. So no question about it.
Do you comment on your criteria for making the moral choice?
Right. My general criteria are the following. Over against the old model that non-intervention is regarded as an absolute rule that never should be violated, I think we ought to expand the reasons that can override the rule. Secondly, I think we ought to restrict who can do the intervening. What I mean by that is, I don't want single states on their own deciding on intervention. So I want multilateral authorization. And then thirdly, I want some assessment ahead of time that the intervention is likely to produce more good than harm. So if you apply that to U.S. foreign policy, then I think the Bosnia case was a case where the degree of damage being done internally justified overriding non-intervention. There was multilateral authorization for it in the UN and in the appropriate European bodies. Thirdly, there was a question about whether you were going to do more harm than good. In the beginning, unfortunately, am on record 3 times being wrong on Bosnia in print. 3 times in print. That's a good record. 3 times in 3 years, I said the wrong thing about Bosnia, because I was afraid that in the face of primitive violence, that is to say World War I rifles that were killing people, you were going to bring in high-tech violence to suppress the primitive violence, and it wasn't going to work. and that we were just going to have a worse situation than before. I was clearly wrong about that. I think it is clear now that if the United States and the Europeans had acted decisively early in the conflict, early when it was Croatia and Serbia, we could have had a very different outcome. So when should we decide? I think we should decide by the nature of the violations that are going on within the country. Secondly, by the kind of authorization the international community provides. And thirdly, by some, this is very difficult to do, but some general assessment that you have the resources to intervene effectively and that you won't simply bungle the case, because a bungled intervention, however good the intentions, is no good.
Would you comment upon the future of China and U.S.-Chinese relations?
Yes, I think that the thing that strikes me about the China question, at least as I view it, and I'm not a regional expert, I think, first of all, you have to think about China as part of the Asian theater. We need to think about it, I think, about an Asian theater the way we've always thought about a European theater. That is to say, an Asian theater that runs across all of East Asia and involves military, political, human rights, and economic issues together. Secondly, that means you've got to engage China on a range of questions and not just one. So while I think that the way in which the human rights criteria have been cut loose on our China policy is a mistake, I also think that it's not simply that you can have a human rights policy to China and nothing else. Because, for example, even if you think about it in moral terms, China is central to the proliferation issue. So if you're trying to prevent proliferation and you're trying to support human rights, you've got two moral goods, and you've got to balance them. Thirdly, my own view is the long-term, larger policy must be a policy of engagement of the Chinese, not isolation of them. But secondly, that doesn't mean, I think, that you can't have a human rights policy, even if you're trying to engage them.
This has been a marvelous evening, as everybody knows. You've done us a great service by presenting, I think, in a most cogent fashion, a huge part of the set of intellectual considerations beneath the questions of where we should be going in foreign policy. We're in your debt, and we enjoy the evening very much.